Hello and welcome to episode 3 of the Pure podcast. My name is Sabine and today I'm joined by celebrant Miranda Ash to talk about giving and writing a eulogy. For many of us, this is something that we never expect to do until we're suddenly faced with it, often at a time when emotions are raw and thinking clearly feels difficult. Miranda has many years of experience writing and delivering eulogies and supporting people to find the right words when they're grieving. Today, we'll talk about what really matters, how to approach it gently, and how to make the process feel a bit more manageable. Firstly, I just want to say, Miranda, thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure. It's great to be here, Sabine.
So, we're going to talk about writing and giving a eulogy, which is something that a lot of people find very challenging. So firstly, I wanted to ask you, why do you think writing a eulogy is something that feels so overwhelming for people, especially when they're grieving?
I think, and I speak about this from my own experience, because the first eulogy I wrote was for my mum's pass, when my mum passed 14 years ago. And when you are in the midst of such grief, literally the peripheries of your brain shut down, and it's very difficult to think in a creative way because you're just trying to go from one thing to the next. You're protecting the feelings that you have, and therefore physiologically our thinking changes when we're in that kind of a situation. And I think that's one of the main reasons why people find it so difficult. It's difficult to think clearly, and you want to do a good job because it's for someone that you loved and respected. And I think also as human beings, are our own worst critic. So I know from experience, oh my goodness, I don't know how many times I rewrote the eulogy I did for my mum, and I still do the same with eulogies I write for others as well now, because you care and because you want to do a good job. And yet often you'll think that it's not that great, but then when others hear it on the day, they'll always say that was beautiful. Um, and you think, oh my goodness, how much did I judge myself for that? So yes, we are our own worst critic, and we don't have to be. And I think we have to understand that whatever we share is whatever needed to be shared. And if, our emotions, or if the grief gets in the way, that's actually a natural part of the process, and that's okay.
Yes, absolutely. So you have obviously written and given many eulogies and also supported others in
Mhm.
writing eulogies. So I wanted to ask you, what are the key elements that make a meaningful eulogy?
There's no right or wrong way to write a eulogy. Depending on who I'm supporting, and also because I like to write creatively, if I wrote the same thing or in the same form every time, I'd get bored. But there's no right or wrong way. You can start in all sorts of different ways. Sometimes I like to give people a snapshot of what was going on at the time when that person came into the world. What was going on historically, what was what was happening in the world, in their community, in their family at that time. And then more often than not, people go chronologically, but you don't have to. You can also organize it by different themes. So, for example, I did a eulogy a few months ago for a lady who was very, very social, and had all sorts of different friend groups and a very close family. And we themed it around those different friend groups and the relationship with their family. So you can do it chronologically, or you can theme it. It depends what works for you and that person.
Mm. Well, that's a really nice idea as well. Make it a bit
Yeah.
different.
Yeah, absolutely.
So people often worry about getting it right. How can you find the stories or the qualities that best captured your loved one's life and then bring that to life in a eulogy?
Well, again, qualities is another theme, another way to theme it. So what I do and have done when I've written eulogies for family and friends in particular is I ask a few people about their memories of that person. I think about my own memories, but when you are in the midst of grief, it's very difficult to sometimes think of those memories in a way that is engaging or feels enticing, although I don't know enticing is the right word, but feels like it's worthy of someone listening to that memory. So I think talking to others is also really important, so that you get another voice as well as your own. And often in the process of having that discussion, you discover things that you didn't know, but you also discover and revisit shared memories. And those conversations, I think, can be extremely cathartic for both people. And a eulogy is, by its very nature, cathartic. It's meant to be. It's meant to give comfort potentially in a time of grief. And still having those conversations as you prepare for that is really, really important. And you'll often find commonalities and shared experiences and memories that you've probably even forgotten that are good to bring out.
I also want to ask you about balancing honesty with sensitivity, because sometimes there might be a difficult relationship, or maybe
Mm.
the person who has passed away had some struggles, and it might feel inauthentic to not mention that in the eulogy, but at the same time people can be a bit cautious of that. So how would you advise someone striking that balance?
It's a really good question, and it's important to cover. We're human. We aren't all perfect. No one's perfect. And I think, we've had a human experience and we need to acknowledge that. But there are ways to artfully acknowledge it without hammering home if that person was really awful. When I go and meet with families, often everyone has a different experience of that person that's passed. And often there are people who, or sometimes there are people who haven't had a great experience. And you need to acknowledge that. But there's a way to do it that is artful. So, for example, recently I did a eulogy for a gentleman, and the way I captured it or introduced it and touched on the challenges was this person, was independent, didn't have an easy life at times, and it's important to acknowledge that. But that doesn't necessarily have to be the whole eulogy, but you do still, I think, in order to do a person justice and to bring healing as well, for those people that are listening, you do need to acknowledge it, but do it in a way that is a light touch potentially, and isn't the whole arc of the eulogy. Now, I've also done eulogies for people that have had a really, really, really tough time, a really rough life. Either they've been through an awful illness, or they have not been necessarily a nice person, and people don't have much to say about them. And you've got to try and, certainly with my job, you've got to try and eke that time out to make a service that is worthy of the time that you have. And there are ways you can do that with adding readings or music instead. So don't feel that if you don't have much to say about someone, don't feel that you have to labour a point. You can do other things to stretch things out, so to speak.
What is the simplest approach, do you think, to create something that is heartfelt but manageable when you have little time to prepare and you're grieving and you have to give a eulogy?
Think about what's important. What would you really like to say about that person? And I'm a visual thinker, so when I am presented with a whole load of different ideas about someone or points about them, I sit down and write out kind of minority report, scattergram, or whatever you call it, style. I'll look at the different themes. I'll look at, what are the stories that absolutely have to be in there. So, for example, recently I did a service for actually someone who had had a direct cremation, and I was working with their family, and there was a lot that they wanted me to cover. And when I sat down and talked with them, I said, what are the important, we have this amount of time, what are the points that you absolutely have to have in there, without fail? And so you prioritize what you really want to say, and then capture it, go with what's the priority first. And anything that's not a priority, you can always share elsewhere afterwards. I always say to families, if you're having a gathering afterwards, continue that storytelling at the gathering. I've even had people do kind of a part one of a eulogy and then a part two elsewhere, so that others can add their voices in and they can continue that sharing, because that sharing is a really important part of the grieving process, because it brings comfort, it brings focus, and it turns us away from the grief momentarily, but also helps us to understand that grief is really love being expressed through that eulogy, and we have to have those stories as a way of helping us to come to terms with that. So don't feel that you have to be pigeonholed into a limit, because there are other ways that you can creatively continue that storytelling, maybe in a different venue or at a different time, that can help with that process.
So you mentioned weaving in multiple voices by doing like a two-parter eulogy, but quite often people want to include multiple voices in the
Yeah.
eulogy. So do you have any other examples of how you can go about that?
Yes. So I work with many families where either they will, I'll write the eulogy and multiple voices will be involved in writing that eulogy, and they want me to deliver that eulogy, or they'll write it and have me deliver it. No, it'll have been a collaborative effort with several people. But also, don't feel that you can't have more than one voice. You can. So, for example, I think one of the best examples I've seen was actually my mum's funeral. I didn't realize that we could have a direct cremation at that point. Another story for another time. But we did have a cremation in a standard crematorium. I think there were 5 tributes that day. We called them tributes, but essentially 5 eulogies. And the way that we did it was my uncle talked about my mum's early life, and both me and my brothers each talked about our memories, because we each of us felt it was really important that we spoke. Each of us had very different memories, and we wanted to share those. And then we had another friend who came and talked about my mum as a friend to so many. And so don't feel that you can only have one tribute. I did a funeral recently for an amazing gentleman, and his family wanted many voices. And what they did was they themed it. So they had someone who came and talked about the child, this person as a child, so a sister who spoke, then a friend from uni who spoke, and then 2 friends from work, and then his son spoke as well, with memories of growing up. And then I did a eulogy that his wife had written, but she didn't feel able to deliver. So you can absolutely, you don't feel that you're constrained by time either, because there are ways that you can do things, but also you don't want it to go on so long that everyone's going to get itchy feet, so to speak. So more often than not, when multiple voices are involved, what I tend to see is people theme it, just like the example that I just gave, so that you aren't kind of doubling up on the same memories.
Yes. You mentioned there that the wife wasn't necessarily comfortable giving her part of the eulogy, and that you read it
Yeah.
for her. And I can imagine that that happens quite often. But for the people that do want to read a eulogy, but they are worried about becoming overwhelmed or emotional, what advice would you give to them?
First of all, I always say, write it down, read from a script. There's just there's comfort in reading from a script. Also, from a timing point of view, it's really important that you read from a script and try not to veer away from it, because otherwise you'll get carried away and lose control. And actually, I think when you're nervous, when you're grieving, you probably will find comfort in that sense of control. So I always say, write it down, read it out loud to yourself. And I train celebrants, and this is a technique that I ask all of them to do when they're writing scripts. Write it down, then read it out loud to yourself to check timing and flow. And there will be things that you'll want to change, because um, writing down something on paper is different to reading it out loud. So you'll want to maybe change some things to bring out more expression, or to watch the timing to make sure that you've got pauses in there, that you think about how to engage with the audience, remembering to look up. One thing that I suggest people do is at the top of every page, and do it as a printout. At the top of every page, in big red pen, write, look up, breathe. Because when we are nervous, we forget to breathe, and also we speed up. So I also write up there, slow down, just as a reminder. And sometimes you can even write between paragraphs, pause, 1, 2, 3, just to remind yourself to just reset your breathing between each paragraph. So those kind of practical techniques help alongside making sure that you write it down to keep on track. And here's the other reason to write it down. I have lost count of the number of people who've asked me for a copy of a eulogy afterwards. And actually, with the families that I work with, I always give them a copy of the full ceremony script and the eulogies, so that they can look back in years to come. And when they need it as a time when they're struggling, I think it's really helpful for people to be able to look back at those stories and remember their person.
Mm.
So yeah. The other thing that I always do in terms of actually delivering on the day, I'll always leave a pile of tissues or a box of tissues for someone. You know, people often say to me, I'm really worried that I'll cry when I deliver the eulogy. And I always say, that's normal. Showing emotions is something that is not to be sneered at. It's actually natural. It endears you to the audience. It shows that you care. And don't be worried if you show emotion. Sometimes when people deliver eulogies themselves and they struggle, I'll always say to people, if you feel that you can't do it, or you struggle and you want to stop, I'll come over and I'll read the rest of it for you. That's perfectly normal too. Or have someone else in the audience who's able to come up and do it for you too. So there's all sorts of different practical steps you can make to enable you to deliver a eulogy and still feel grounded and able to do it, or have someone else do it for you.
Yes, absolutely. Um, At Pure Cremation, we talk a lot about choosing a farewell that is right for the person that has passed, and for their family as well. Because for so long, funerals have followed a very traditional format, which is absolutely fine if that's what people want to choose. But sometimes that doesn't feel right for everybody. But with a celebration of life, or a memorial service, or anything that isn't a typical funeral, you might still very much like to give a eulogy, but perhaps you want to shake things up a bit and do something that is a bit simpler, maybe a bit less formal. Do you have any tips for how you could do that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I did a celebration of life for someone who lived on a farm, and we actually did their celebration on the farm in the orchard. And the way that we did it, and it was one of the most memorable ones I've ever done, we gathered in the farmyard, and then we all took the walk that he took with his dog every day. And we then gathered in a wooded glade on the farm, where we lit a fire, and we sat around and shared memories. And that actually was so profound, because we felt like we were walking in his steps. We were. And we also invited those that wanted to to be able to share a few words without feeling like there was a formality to it. You know, celebrations of life and funerals do not have to be formal. They don't have to follow a structure, even if you have it in a formal place, such as a crematorium or a chapel. They don't have to follow a structure. It's completely up to you. And I think that's what I love about doing this work, because no two people that you are celebrating are the same, and therefore their ceremonies shouldn't necessarily be the same either. I can understand why people do want something that's maybe formulaic. When you're in the midst of grief, you can't necessarily think in the same in creatively, but that's where talking about your final wishes comes into play and is important. I've made it very clear to my family what I want to happen when I'm gone, how I want to be celebrated, which is party in a field with a big bonfire, basically. Um, but and it's important to have those conversations, so it removes the guesswork. And it's also important to have those conversations about how you would like to be remembered and how you would like to be celebrated, and especially if it's not in a typical way, so that families can think about how to do things. I've also done ceremonies on beaches as well, where we have gathered on a beach, had a picnic, and we've had an informal sharing of that person. I actually really like doing those kind of ceremonies. So do what works for you and that person, and you can't go wrong, really. There's all sorts of ways you can do it, and don't feel that you have to be constrained to what you typically see. Do what that person would like. It could be in your back garden. It could be in your living room. It could be in a favorite place. I did a celebration of life for someone at the venue where their daughter got married a few years ago, because that was a place where they always gathered as a family, and they gathered for happy memories and difficult memories like this. But they always knew it was a place that they could come back to and gather as a family. So they continued that tradition with their celebration of life.
Yes. And it doesn't necessarily have to be in person either. I was speaking
No.
to a gentleman who wrote a touching eulogy for his father, and then he wrote it into Christmas cards and sent that out to friends and family, which is a really nice way to share his dad's legacy and love for Christmas. So,
I love that. That is
yeah.
such a good idea. Also, think about video, and it doesn't even have to be words. So I haven't worked with the family that have done this, but I have seen this where they've done essentially a slideshow of that person, put it up on a platform and shared it with people. Sometimes it doesn't have to be words. It can be in visual, it can be videos, it can be photographs, it can be music. You know, it could be a piece of art. Do what works for you and for that person. I did see something. This is years ago. Someone who was an artist and very community based, and they invited everyone to share their favorite memories in pictorial form, whether it was an actual drawing or a photograph. They wanted something visual, and they put it together into a beautiful collage and then shared it with everyone. So even if you're not having a physical gathering, there are such lovely ways you can do it. And that Christmas card idea is, I'm taking that one. I'm going to use that.
We've shared some really different and interesting and big ideas here, but there is also nothing wrong with doing something really low key and personal. So whatever works for people, I guess, is the message.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the most profound and memorable gatherings I ever went to was for a friend who didn't want anything um, big. And what we did for them was we all gathered at a friend's house. We sat in a circle in the garden with the person's favorite drink, and we just talked. We talked about those memories. We didn't plan anything apart from the food and the drink. We didn't plan. And actually, sometimes just sitting and talking about those memories spontaneously is all you need to do. it's about what works for you. And one other point to make is sometimes I hear people say, if we do it this way, are we going to be judged? No, no. There's no judgment, certainly from someone like me. There's no judgment. You have to honor and celebrate a person in whatever way works for you. And sometimes it's the simple acts, the simple gestures, the simple conversations that matter the most.
What would you say to someone who has been listening to our conversation now and they are still overwhelmed and lost and unsure where to begin? What would you say to them?
First of all, don't feel under any time constraint to get things done in a certain time. I've recently been working with several families whose loved one have had a direct cremation, and in one case it was well over a year ago, and they have not felt able to plan anything or do anything until now. So don't feel that you have to rush something. Sometimes actually waiting is better, because we can plan something when we aren't maybe in the midst of the extreme grief that you feel in the weeks after someone has gone. So first of all, think about when you want to, if you're going to do something, when, but don't again feel constrained by time. And really sit down and think about what's important to share about that person. If there were 3 things that you'd want to share about that person, what would they be? I think sometimes when we're starting to look at eulogies and writing tributes, we're completely overwhelmed because we want to do that person justice, but we are overwhelmed with the amount of information sometimes. And actually, there's a need to simplify things. And if there were 3 things you were going to share about that person or say about that person, what would they be? Start there and go from there. And then usually it will expand from there. And sometimes it'll just stay with 2 or 3 points, and that's all that's needed.
Thank you so much to everyone who has been listening. For more resources like this one and to be the first to hear new episodes, go to purecremation.co.uk/subscribe. Until next time.